Now we are going to discuss robotics, laparoscopy and bariatric surgery. So first we are going to start the laparoscopy. For creating pneumoperitoneum, what's the name of needle? So this is the needle which is used for creating pneumoperitoneum. What's the name of this needle? This is Veery's needle. This image based question was asked both in NEET PG as well as in AIIMS. So this is Veery's needle used for creating the pneumoperitoneum. Now see here we are going to attach the gas source, okay, and you can see that it is having bevel tip and there is safety valve here. Clear? So because of this safety valve, it is going to prevent the injury of bowel. So there is decreased risk of bowel injury because of this safety valve. Whenever we are using Veery's needle for creating pneumoperitoneum, this is known as closed method. And if we use Hassan cannula for creating pneumoperitoneum, since we are creating pneumoperitoneum under direct vision with Hassan cannula, it is known as open method. So see the methods of creating pneumoperitoneum. First, closed method, and the second is open method. So here you can see in closed method we are using Veery's needle, and we discussed that in Veery's needle there is safety valve at the tip. So here you can see there is safety valve at the tip. It is having bevel tip with blunt end, and because of this safety valve, whenever we are creating the pneumoperitoneum, if bowel comes in contact, because of this safety valve the injury is prevented. And if we want to decrease the risk of vascular injury, since the pneumoperitoneum is created under direct vision, we use Hassan cannula. So Veery's needle, it is having low risk of bowel injury because of safety valve at the tip. The name of this instrument is Hassan cannula. This is Hassan cannula, and here we create pneumoperitoneum under direct vision, and that's why it is known as open method. So these are the two methods which are used. Now see, whenever we are creating pneumoperitoneum, where are we supposed to place the trocar? So generally trocar is placed at or just below umbilicus. So what is the site of trocar placement? It is placed at or just below umbilicus. Okay, this is first important point. And the second important point is that during creation of pneumoperitoneum, the trocar is going to penetrate how many layers? So how many layers are penetrated? So imagine these are the layers. Clear? So trocar is going to penetrate these layers. So what is the first layer? First is skin. So can you see? This is skin. Then there is superficial fascia. After that there is deep fascia. After that there is fascia transversalis, and then there is parietal peritoneum. There is parietal peritoneum. So these are 5 layers which are penetrated during creation of pneumoperitoneum, and these layers are penetrated by trocar. So skin, second is superficial fascia, third is deep fascia, fourth is fascia transversalis, and fifth is parietal peritoneum. So there are one-liner questions which are frequently asked in relation to laparoscopy. First, most commonly used gas for creation of pneumoperitoneum, carbon dioxide. What should be the flow of gas? 1 liter per minute, and the intra-abdominal pressure maintained during laparoscopy, it's the 12 to 15 mmHg. So see the one-liner questions. First, what's the most commonly used gas for creation of pneumoperitoneum? And it is CO2. What should be the flow of gas? Flow of gas, and it should be 1 liter per minute. Flow of gas 1 liter per minute, and intra-abdominal pressure maintained during laparoscopy. Intra-abdominal pressure maintained during laparoscopy. This was asked many times, and it is 12 to 15 mmHg. Clear? These are the one-liner questions. Now see what are the complications of laparoscopy. After laparoscopic procedure, you know that there is CO2 retention, and because of this CO2 retention, there is irritation of undersurface of diaphragm, and whenever there is irritation of undersurface of diaphragm, there is referred pain to shoulder via phrenic nerve. Second, sometimes whenever we are creating the pneumoperitoneum with the help of Veress needle, this Veress needle is going to puncture a vein accidentally, and accidentally via the Veress needle there is insufflation of gas into the vein. So this is what gas embolism, and the most commonly used gas is CO2. So this is known as CO2 embolism. Okay, so see what are the complications of laparoscopy. Complications of laparoscopy. Clear? First is there is CO2 retention. Because of that, there is shoulder pain. So there is shoulder pain. So what's the cause of this shoulder pain? There is CO2 retention. Because of this CO2 retention, there is irritation of undersurface of diaphragm. So there is irritation of diaphragm. Clear? And because of that, there is referred pain to the shoulder. There is referred pain to shoulder via phrenic nerve. Clear? Via phrenic nerve. If you remember, in splenic trauma we discussed that because of splenic trauma sometimes there is collection of blood under the left dome of diaphragm, and this blood is going to irritate the undersurface of diaphragm, and via phrenic nerve the pain is referred to left shoulder. What's the name of this sign? This is Kehr's sign we discussed. So similar mechanism is here. Second, there is gas embolism. So during induction of pneumoperitoneum, when Veress needle enters into a vein, what happens? There is insufflation of gas. So what happens? There is insufflation of gas into vein, into open vein, and this leads to gas embolism. What is the most commonly used gas? Carbon dioxide, and that's why it is also known as CO2 embolism. CO2 embolism. Clear? So via the vein CO2 is going into systemic circulation, and then there is pulmonary excretion. Because of this increased pulmonary excretion of CO2, what's the problem? Because of this CO2 there is initial rise of EtCO2, end-tidal CO2. So there is initial rise of end-tidal CO2, but what will happen? After some time, because of decreased cardiac output, it is going to fall. So there is sudden decrease due to fall in cardiac output, because of decreased cardiac output or fall in cardiac output. So what happens? The Veress needle enters into an open vein, there is direct insufflation of CO2, and then there is pulmonary excretion. So initial rise of EtCO2 is there, but what is the problem? There is sudden decrease because of decrease in cardiac output. So these are the complications. One is shoulder pain and the second is gas embolism. Now question comes that what are the gases which are used for creating pneumoperitoneum? Initially, pneumoperitoneum was created with filtered air. But what's the problem with filtered air? There is increased risk of gas embolism. That's why nowadays we are not using filtered air. Two gases which are commonly used. One is carbon dioxide and second is nitrous oxide. Now see, CO2 is the most preferred. Why? Because it doesn't support combustion. So we can use CO2 even in long duration surgery, short duration surgery. Nitrous oxide, the problem that it supports combustion. That's why you cannot use it for long duration surgery. The advantage of nitrous oxide that it is having mild analgesic effect. And because of that, you can use it for short duration surgery. So see what are the gases used for creating pneumoperitoneum. Gases used for creating pneumoperitoneum. Okay. So first gas used was filtered air. Filtered air was the first gas used. Why we are not using it? Because it is associated with increased risk of gas embolism. Okay, two gases which are commonly used, most preferred, it's the carbon dioxide and the second is nitrous oxide. So CO2 is most preferred. It is 200 times more diffusible than air, 200 times more diffusible. It is rapidly cleared from body and lungs, and very important property, it does not support combustion. That's why this is most preferred. We can use it for long duration as well as for short duration surgery. Nitrous oxide, it is 68% as rapidly absorbed in blood as CO2. And advantage is that it is having mild analgesic effect. Because of this, it's used for short operative procedure. But the problem that it supports combustion, and since it supports combustion, we are not using it for long duration surgery. So these are the commonly used gases for creation of pneumoperitoneum. Now see, what are the surgeries which are included in minimal access surgery? Nowadays, you will notice that most of the tertiary care hospitals, they have a separate department known as minimal access surgery. So what are the surgeries which are included in minimal access surgery? So it includes laparoscopy, thoracoscopy, endoluminal endoscopy or perivisceral endoscopy. Even arthroscopy and intra-articular joint surgery are included in minimal access surgery. Now, what are the advantages of minimal access surgery? Nowadays, you know that the paying capacity of most of the patients are increased. Most of the patients are insured also. That's why they are opting minimal access surgeries over open surgeries. Why? See, in minimal access surgery, the size of wound is small. And because of this small size of wound, there is lesser risk of complication. There is early return to work. So directly or indirectly, the advantages of minimal access surgery is related to decreased wound size. So see, what are the advantages of minimal access surgery? Advantages of minimal access surgery. So in minimal access surgery, there is decreased wound size, and that's why there is reduction in wound dehiscence, reduction is in wound infection, there is lesser bleeding, low risk of herniation and low risk of nerve entrapment. Now see, since the size of wound is lesser or smaller, there is decreased wound pain and there is improved mobility. There is decreased wound trauma, decreased heat loss, improved vision. Most of the students are confused that sir, how in laparoscopy or in minimal access surgery there is improved vision. So see, we use laparoscope and it is having magnification. So the thing which appears smaller, it is magnified during laparoscopy or during minimal access surgery. Second, imagine you are doing some esophageal surgery. It's very difficult to visualize esophagus in open surgery. But what? Your camera can reach up to the esophagus and you can visualize it. So that's why there is improved vision in minimal access surgery because of magnification. Clear? And your camera can reach to the areas which are difficult to visualize in open surgery. And what is the main advantage why most of the patients are going for minimal access surgery? Because there is faster recovery and shorter hospital stay. So if there is faster recovery and shorter hospital stay, what happens? There is early return to work. Early return to work. Clear? So these are the advantages of minimal access surgery. In most of the hospitals nowadays, there is another department, day care surgery department. So what? This is day care surgery. So day care surgery means here patient is admitted for 12 hours and there is same day discharge. So this is day care surgery. What are the other names of day care surgery? It is also known as day surgery, same day surgery, day only surgery or ambulatory surgery. So the question which is asked that for how long patient is admitted for 12 hours. You have to remember the duration for 12 hours and there is same day discharge. Same day discharge. Clear? There are two other questions which are also asked. One is overnight stay surgery. So the name is overnight stay. So here patient is going to stay in the night and the patient is admitted for 23 hours. There is early morning discharge and there is short stay surgery. In short stay surgery, patient is admitted for 72 hours. So two important questions. First, overnight stay. Overnight stay surgery. So here the term is self-explanatory that there is night stay. So what's the duration of admission? The patient is admitted for 23 hours. Admitted for 23 hours and there is early morning discharge. So there is early morning discharge. Clear? And third which is asked is the short stay surgery. Short stay surgery. So here patient is admitted for 72 hours. So what's the duration? 72 hours. So what are the three questions which are asked? First, in day care surgery, patient is admitted for 12 hours. In overnight stay surgery, patient is admitted for 23 hours and for short stay surgery, patient is admitted for 72 hours. In AIIMS, there was one indirect question related to fast track surgery. So see, what is fast track surgery? Fast track surgery. It is also known as enhanced recovery after surgery, and this was the question in AIIMS. It is also known as enhanced recovery after surgery. So enhanced recovery after surgery. So it is self-explanatory that what is seen here, there should be enhanced recovery after surgery in fast track surgery. So in this what we do basically, there is coordinated perioperative approach to reduce the surgical stress so that it is going to facilitate the post-operative recovery. Now see, in majority of patients, just before surgery, there is stress, and because of this stress, there is activation of sympathetic system. Now what is the effect of this sympathetic system over the bowel motility? That sympathetic system activation impairs peristalsis, and because of this what happens? There is ileus. So because of sympathetic overactivity, so if we can reduce the stress, there can be faster recovery. Second, during surgery, if we give increased amount of fluid or if there is fluid overload, because of this there is bowel edema, and if there is bowel edema, again it is going to prolong the ileus. So second thing we are going to follow under this protocol, that we have to restrict the intravenous fluid. Third, during anesthesia, some of the anesthetists are giving opiates, and you know what is the effect of opiate? It is going to impair the peristalsis. It is going to cause constipation. So again there will be ileus. So we are going for coordinative perioperative approach to reduce the surgical stress so that we are going to facilitate the post-operative recovery. So what's done here? There is coordinated perioperative approach. Clear? And why? To reduce the surgical stress. To reduce surgical stress and to facilitate post-operative recovery. Clear? Now see, what are the components of fast track surgery? Components. So we have to take pre-operative informed consent, and there should be fasting. What is the duration of fasting for solids and liquids? So there should be 6 hours, the fasting duration, 6 hours for solids and 2 hours, its minimum 2 hours for liquids. So 6 hours for solids, 2 hours for liquid. This is asked frequently. There should be a traumatic surgical technique. And second, we have to put the drain or not. So generally we avoid placing drains. So avoid placement of drains. Clear? we have to reduce the stress. So sometimes it is seen that we have to give the sweet drinks to the patient 2 to 3 hours before surgery. So how you can reduce the stress? By giving sweet drinks to the patients 2 to 3 hours before surgery. Elimination of pain by regional anesthesia technique. So which technique we use here? We use thoracic epidural anesthesia. We use thoracic epidural anesthesia. Clear? So elimination of pain by regional anesthesia technique. We have to optimize fluid and temperature management, and we discussed fluid overload should be avoided because fluid overload leads to bowel edema and it leads to prolonged ileus. We have to start early enteral diet. What enteral diet? We have to prevent GI atony and post-op nausea and vomiting. So during anesthetic management, generally we avoid what? Opiates, and we have to follow rapid post-operative mobilization. Clear? So these are the components of fast track surgery, which is also known as enhanced recovery after surgery. Another question which was asked 2 to 3 times in NEET: what is NOTES? So full form of NOTES is natural orificial transluminal endoscopic surgery. So what's the full form? It is the natural orificial transluminal endoscopic surgery. So this is NOTES. So what is done in NOTES? Here, the peritoneal cavity is entered via natural orifice. So what? Peritoneal cavity is entered via natural orifice like mouth, rectum and vagina, and we are going to perform the surgery. Suppose I'm going to perform the cholecystectomy. So via natural orifice I'm going into stomach, from oral cavity going into stomach, performing gastrotomy, going to perform cholecystectomy and taking out the gallbladder. Now see, what is the advantage? There is no scar because we are using the natural orifice. So which natural orifices are used? Generally we use mouth, rectum and vagina. See how it's performed. See the diagrammatic representation. If you see this patient, I'm using oral cavity and I'm inserting the endoscope. It is going into esophagus and then into stomach. In stomach, I'm going to perform the gastrotomy, making one incision into stomach, and via stomach now I entered into peritoneal cavity, and what? I'm going to perform the cholecystectomy and then I'm taking out the gallbladder from natural orifice. Clear? Now see here, I can use the rectum also, and I can use the vagina. Via vagina I'm going into uterus, and then via uterus I'm entering into peritoneal cavity and performing the surgery. So there can be transgastric, transvaginal, transrectal approach. So here you can see I'm using stomach, so this is known as transgastric approach. I'm using rectum, known as transrectal approach, and if I'm using vagina, this is known as transvaginal approach. And here you can see I'm performing what? Cholecystectomy. Two surgeries which can easily be performed via NOTES, that is cholecystectomy and appendectomy. So advantage that this is scarless surgery. There is no scar. Scarless surgery. There is no scar because natural orifice is used, and two surgeries which can easily be performed via NOTES. One is cholecystectomy, and the second is appendectomy. So these two surgeries were successfully performed via NOTES. Nowadays, we can use NOTES for other interventions also. So for which other surgical procedures we can use NOTES? So NOTES can also be used for, first, staging of intra-abdominal malignancy. It can be used for staging of intra-abdominal malignancies. Clear? We can use it for segmental colectomy and gastrojejunostomy. So it can be used for segmental colectomy and gastrojejunostomy. Clear? There was one modification of notes which was asked previously in both NEET and NIMS, and that is POEM. What is the full form of POEM? It's per oral endoscopic myotomy, and this POEM is used for which particular condition? Achalasia cardia. So see, what is POEM? The full form of POEM, it is per oral. This is per oral endoscopic myotomy. Clear? So this is per oral endoscopic myotomy, and it is performed for achalasia cardia. If you remember, what happens in achalasia cardia? There is spasm of LES, lower esophageal sphincter. So in treatment, surgical treatment, we have to divide the circular muscle fibers, and that is known as Heller's cardiomyotomy. Similarly, via flexible endoscope, here also we are going to divide the circular muscle layer. How? Have a look. So in this case, I'm going to create a longitudinal incision here with the help of this flexible endoscope, and after creating this incision, I'm going for this fluid injection. So I'm going to inject the fluid. After injecting the fluid, we create a submucosal tunnel. So can you see here? We create this submucosal tunnel. So after creating the tunnel, can you see, we are going to divide the circular muscle fibers. And when the procedure is completed, we are going to apply the hemostatic clip at the site of incision. So this is how POEM is performed. We have to create a longitudinal incision, perform the fluid injection, then we create a submucosal tunnel and divide the inner circular muscle layer, and after completing the procedure, we have to apply the hemostatic clip. So this is POEM performed for achalasia cardia. Now we are going to discuss the robotic surgery, and in robotic surgery, first see the history of robotic surgery. So first, in 1985, the robot name was Puma 560. So what was the name of robot? It was Puma 560, and this robot was used to place a needle in brain under CT guidance. So Puma 560 was used to place a needle in brain under CT guidance. Clear? In which particular year? In 1985. Now in 1987, first time laparoscopic surgery was performed by the robot. And which surgery was that? It was the laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So in 1987, the robot was used to perform first laparoscopic surgery. Clear? And that surgery was what? It was cholecystectomy. So in 1987, first laparoscopic cholecystectomy was performed with the help of robot. In 1988, prostatic surgery was performed with the help of robot, and the name of that robot was Probot. In 1988, what was the name? P-Robot. So this is spelling P-Robot, Probot, and it was used for prostatic surgery. Clear? In 1992, there was robot used, RoboDoc. What was the name? The name of robot was RoboDoc, and this robot was used to mill out precise fitting. It was used to mill out precise fitting in femur during hip replacement. So it was used to mill out precise fitting of femur for hip replacement. Clear? So these are the important points related to history of robotic surgery. But nowadays, what is the question which is asked? That what is the most commonly used robot worldwide? And that is Da Vinci robot. And on which principle Da Vinci robot works? It works on master-slave principle. Now see how it looks like. So this is the Da Vinci robot. Clear? And this is most commonly used robot worldwide. It is based on master-slave principle. So can you see here? Surgeon is the master and robot is the slave. So what happens? The surgeon is going to insert the hand into the console or master. And what happens? The motions of surgeon hand are translated into the motions of robotic hand. So master is the surgeon and robot is a slave. We need one assistant also. Why? To change the instrument. Clear? So it is based on master-slave principle. This is the question which is asked. Okay, and what happens in this case? The motions of surgeon hands, these are translated into motions of robotic hands. Clear? So translated into motions of robotic hands. Okay. Now the problem with the robots that these robots are very expensive. So we can perform laparoscopy, cholecystectomy, we can perform appendectomy with the help of the robots. But what's the problem? We have to include the cost of robot, partial cost of robot in the surgery. So surgery becomes very expensive. That's why it's not feasible to commonly perform surgery with robot. So in which cases we are using the robotic or robot for the surgery? The surgeries where there is limited space or visualization is limited, like whenever we are performing cardiac valve repair, whenever we are performing urological surgeries or gynecological operations, for that we use the robot. So what are the indications of robotic surgery? Indications. So generally it is used for urological surgeries like prostatectomy. Okay, we are using it for cardiac valve repair, and it is also used for gynecological operations. Clear? So any surgery where there is limited space or there is limited visualization. Clear? So for those surgeries we are using robot. So these are the indications of robotic surgery. Now we are going to discuss bariatric surgery. So what is bariatric surgery? It includes surgical procedures performed for the treatment of obesity. So it includes surgical procedures performed for the treatment of obesity. Okay. So why we want to treat the obesity? Because there are many pathological consequences. So what are those pathological consequences? System wise we are going to discuss. So see, the pathological consequences of obesity. Pathological consequences system wise. Okay. So you know, in patients of obesity there is increased mortality. Okay. What are the endocrine? You know, in obesity there is increased mortality. And you know, what are the consequences on endocrine system? So you know that patients of obesity, they have insulin resistance. So there is increased risk of insulin resistance, and that's why these patients are prone to develop what? Type 2 diabetes mellitus. So patients are going to develop type 2 diabetes mellitus. In obese patients, what is the effect on cardiovascular system? So you know that there is increased risk of atherosclerosis, increased risk of coronary artery disease, and in these patients there is increased risk of congestive heart failure. Obese patients have increased risk of obstructive sleep apnea. So what is the effect on pulmonary system? There is increased risk of obstructive sleep apnea. These patients are prone to develop pulmonary hypertension. Clear? You know, obesity is the risk factor for deep venous thrombosis, and because of deep venous thrombosis there is increased risk of pulmonary embolism. Clear? So what happens? There is increased risk of DVT, and because of that there is increased risk of pulmonary embolism. What are the changes which are seen in hepatobiliary system? Because of increased fat intake or because of obesity, there is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And you know, obesity is a risk factor for gallstone. So there is increased risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and these patients are prone to develop what? Gallstones, because obesity is going to increase the risk of gallstones. There is increased risk of osteoarthritis. Why? Because of increased weight. So in bones and joints, increased risk of osteoarthritis. And in obese patients, you'll find that there is increased risk of venous stasis and ulcers. So there is increased risk of venous stasis and ulcers. You know, what are the neurological manifestations or what are the consequences on CNS? These patients are at increased risk of stroke. There is increased risk of pseudotumor cerebri and there is increased risk of carpal tunnel syndrome. So increased risk of stroke, pseudotumor cerebri, and there is increased risk of carpal tunnel syndrome. And you know, obese patients have increased risk of hypogonadism. So in males, there is hypogonadism, there is increased risk of gynecomastia. And what's the problem in obese females? During 3rd to 4th decade, there is increased risk of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So in reproductive system, there can be male hypogonadism. So there is increased risk of male hypogonadism, gynecomastia, clear? And in females, there is increased risk of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So these are the pathological consequences. Second problem, that obesity is going to increase the risk of most of the adenocarcinoma, right? So what are the malignancies whose risk is increased by obesity? So it is going to increase the risk of carcinoma prostate, carcinoma endometrium, carcinoma esophagus and liver carcinoma. Okay, all these are adenocarcinoma. Carcinoma esophagus can be squamous cell carcinoma or adenocarcinoma. Obesity is going to increase the risk of adenocarcinoma. It increases the risk of carcinoma cervix, carcinoma pancreas, carcinoma gallbladder, ovarian cancer, and there is increased risk of RCC, means malignancies of kidney, breast cancer, bile duct and colon. So these are the malignancies whose risk is increased by obesity. So how to remember? The mnemonic is, can you see? Peel, CP, Go, KBC. So the mnemonic is, it's the Peel, CP, Go, KBC. Clear? Prostate, endometrium, esophagus, liver, cervix, pancreas, Go, gallbladder, ovarian, KBC, kidney, breast, bile duct and colon. So this list is very, very important. You have to remember, and there is a mnemonic, so there is no problem. After that, body mass index is asked both in medicine, surgery, and it is also asked in PSM. So what is the other name of body mass index? It is also known as Quetelet index. What's the other name? It is also known as Quetelet index. Okay. And what is the formula for body mass index? It is weight in kg divided by height in meter square. So formula, this is weight in kg divided by height in meter square. Clear? So what is the unit? It is kg per meter square. Now see the various categories and their respective BMI. So if the patient is underweight, what should be the BMI? BMI is less than 18.5 kg per meter square. And if a normal patient is there, generally in normal patients, the BMI should be in between 18.5 to 24.9, right? After that, overweight patients are there. And in overweight patients, what's the range? It's 25 to 29.9. Then obesity is further divided into class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 1 is known as obesity, class 2 is known as severe obesity, and class 3 is known as morbid obesity. So see what is the BMI in class 1 obesity. This you have to remember because this is frequently asked. So in class 1, it is 30 to 34.9. Clear? And in class 2, it is 35 to 39.9. So this is 35 to 39.9. And in class 4, it is 40 to 49.9. So this is 40 to 49.9. and in cases of super obesity it is more than 50. Clear? So this is frequently asked. This BMI you are supposed to remember. In class 1 obesity 30 to 34.9, class 2 that is known as severe obesity 35 to 39.9, and in class 3 that is known as morbid obesity, and here the BMI is 40 to 49.9. Now why we discussed BMI? Because I want to tell you the indications for bariatric surgery. So there are two standards, one international standards and second is Asian standards. So according to international standards, what are the indications of bariatric surgery? BMI more than equal to 35 kg per meter square with comorbidities, and second, BMI more than equal to 40 kg per meter square with or without comorbidities. This is international standards. And according to Asian standards, what we have to do, we have to subtract 2.5 in each. So BMI more than equal to 32.5 kg per meter square with comorbidities, or BMI more than equal to 37.5 kg per meter square with or without comorbidities. So you have to remember the indications, both indications. See, indications of bariatric surgery according to international standards, clear, and according to Asian standards, clear. So for Asian population and for international population. So see here, BMI body mass index more than equal to 35 kg per meter square plus comorbidities, clear, or BMI more than equal to 40 kg per meter square with or without comorbidity, with or without comorbidity. Clear? How to remember the Asian standards or indications for Asian population? You have to subtract 2.5 in each category. So in the first category, it is how much? BMI more than equal to 32.5 kg per meter square plus comorbidity. Clear? And our body mass index more than equal to 37.5 kg per meter square with or without comorbidity. So with or without comorbidity. Okay, so these are the indications. Now see the various types of bariatric operations. So what are the types of bariatric operations or bariatric surgery? Types of bariatric operations. So the types of bariatric operations are vertical banded gastroplasty, laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding. Vertical banded gastroplasty, in short it is known as VBG. Laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding, it is known as LAGB. There is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, it is known as RYGB. Biliopancreatic diversion, in short it is known as BPD, and there is duodenal switch. So these are the types of bariatric operations. Now first question which is asked. Now out of these 5 bariatric surgical procedures, questions are asked which is purely restrictive, which is largely restrictive, and which is largely malabsorptive. Now what is restrictive, what is malabsorptive? Say, whenever we are going to perform the surgery which is going to restrict the oral intake, so if it is going to restrict the oral intake, it is restrictive, and if the surgical procedure is going to impair the absorption, it is malabsorptive. So if we see this vertical banded gastroplasty and laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding, these are purely restrictive. These are purely restrictive. Clear? If we see this Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, this is largely restrictive, mildly malabsorptive. So this is largely restrictive, and mildly malabsorptive. This is mildly malabsorptive. Clear? And if we see this biliopancreatic diversion and duodenal switch, these are largely malabsorptive, mildly restrictive. So these are largely malabsorptive, clear, and mildly restrictive. So largely malabsorptive, mildly restrictive. Clear? Another question. This was asked in AIIMS that out of these five, which one is most commonly performed bariatric surgical procedure worldwide? So most commonly performed bariatric surgical procedure worldwide, this is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, in short known as RYGB. So this is most commonly performed worldwide. Most commonly performed worldwide. And out of these five, which one is safest and reversible? So it's LAGB. This is safest and reversible. Clear? So these are commonly asked questions related to types of bariatric surgery. Now one by one we are going to discuss how we are going to perform these surgical procedures. First we are going to discuss vertical banded gastroplasty. So what's the name of this procedure? Vertical banded gastroplasty. Vertical means, can you see here, the staples are applied vertically. Can you see? So here these staples are applied vertically. So this is vertical. Okay. Second, we are going to use a band. Can you see the band? So here you are going to apply a band. So staples are applied vertically and we are using a band to create a small pouch of stomach. So capacity of this pouch is small. So whenever patient is going to eat something, patient is having heaviness. A patient is having sensation of heaviness. So this vertical banded gastroplasty is purely restrictive procedure. So this is purely restrictive procedure. So here we are going to apply vertical staples and using a band to create small pouch of stomach. Now see this. This is laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding. What's the name? Laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding. So can you see, we are using here adjustable band of silicone. So silicone band is applied in the proximal part of stomach and there is one access port. Clear? So we can release the pressure and we can make it more tight. Right? Now what happens whenever we are going to apply this adjustable band and patient is going to eat something? What happens after eating even little amount of food? Patient is having heaviness. So again, this laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding is also purely restrictive operation. So it is purely restrictive, and we discussed that this is safest, reversible and least invasive. So this is safest, reversible and least invasive. Clear? And in this case, this silicone band is applied over the proximal part of stomach to create small proximal pouch. So it is applied over proximal part of stomach to create small proximal pouch. So this is laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding. The most commonly performed bariatric procedure is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. So in short, it is known as RYGB, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. How we create Roux-en-Y gastric bypass? See, imagine that this is stomach. Clear? This is duodenum and this is jejunum. Clear? I'm going to divide jejunum. Clear? And what I'm going to do after dividing this jejunum, I'm going to take this proximal part of jejunum to the stomach. But first we have to create a small pouch of stomach. So can you see? This is the small pouch of stomach created. So you can see I divided the stomach and I created a small proximal pouch. This distal part of stomach is bypassed. Okay, and I'm taking this distal part of jejunum. This is proximal jejunum, this is distal jejunum, and this distal jejunum is anastomosed to this proximal part of stomach. So see the final diagram. The final diagram will be something like this. This is the distal part of jejunum. So this gastrojejunostomy is done, and this is the jejunojejunostomy, where proximal part of jejunum is anastomosed to distal part. Clear? So what is the name of this procedure? This is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Why? Because this distal part of stomach is bypassed. Now the questions. How much is the quantity of this proximal gastric pouch? And the quantity is, or capacity is, 30 to 50 ml. Clear? So the capacity of proximal gastric pouch is 30 to 50 ml. Second, what is the length of this Roux limb? This is known as Y limb, and this is known as Roux limb. Clear? So the length of this Roux limb is 70 to 100 centimeter. It's in between, average 17 to 100 centimeter. So this is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Now see, this is largely restrictive. Why? Because it is going to restrict the intake because of smaller proximal gastric pouch. But you can see that bile and pancreatic juice, it is going to mix with food after 70 to 100 centimeter of jejunum. So that's why it is mildly malabsorptive also. So important questions. First, this is the most commonly performed bariatric surgery procedure. Bariatric surgery procedure. Second, it is largely restrictive and mildly malabsorptive. Clear? So see the diagrammatic representation. So you can see this is how it looks like. This is the proximal gastric pouch, and the content is 30 to 50 ml. This is the length of jejunum and Roux limb, and this is 70 to 100 centimeter. It is variable, right? Now see, there is one liner question which is asked in NEET frequently. Sometimes there is herniation of bowel loop behind the Roux limb. So sometimes there is herniation of bowel loop behind the Roux limb. And what's the name of this hernia? This is known as Peterson hernia. So what happens in Peterson hernia? After Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, so after RYGB, what's the problem? There is herniation. This is internal hernia. So herniation behind Roux limb. Clear? Herniation behind Roux limb. So this is Peterson hernia. The most effective bariatric surgery means the bariatric surgery associated with maximum weight loss is the biliopancreatic diversion. This is biliopancreatic diversion. Okay. So first see the important questions related to biliopancreatic diversion. This is most effective bariatric surgery. Most effective bariatric surgery. Why? Because it is associated with maximum weight loss. It is associated with maximum weight loss. How we are going to perform biliopancreatic diversion? Have a look. It's very easy to understand. See, this is the stomach, this is the duodenum, this is the jejunum, and this is the ileum, this is the cecum, this is appendix. Here you can see this is liver, this is gallbladder, this is the bile duct, and this is pancreas. First, what we are going to do, we are going to perform distal gastrectomy. Okay, you performed distal gastrectomy. After that, what you are going to do, you are going to divide the junction of jejunum and ileum. Clear? So this is jejunum and this is ileum, and this ileum is taken where? To the stomach. Clear? And what happens? This jejunum is taken to distal part of ileum. Apart from this, I'm going to perform cholecystectomy and appendectomy. So what is the final surgery? See, this is the stomach. You perform distal gastrectomy and you took ileum to the stomach. So what? You are going to perform this kind of anastomosis. What's the name of this anastomosis? This is gastroileostomy. What's the name of anastomosis? Ileum is anastomosed to stomach. So this is gastroileostomy. Here you can see this is what cecum and appendectomy has been done. Now see, this is the duodenum, clear? And this is the jejunum. This jejunum is anastomosed to distal part of ileum. So it is anastomosed to distal part of ileum. So what's the name of this anastomosis? This is jejunoileostomy. This is duodenum. Now see, this is the liver. You removed the gallbladder, so gallbladder is removed. And what? This anastomosis is done. So what are the parts of this surgery? First, what you did? You performed distal gastrectomy. Okay, we performed distal gastrectomy. What? We performed cholecystectomy. Here you can see. We performed what? Appendectomy. Appendectomy. Clear? And what are the anastomosis? Can you see? We perform anastomosis, gastroileostomy. And what is the fifth? Jejunoileostomy. So what are the steps of this procedure? Distal gastrectomy, cholecystectomy, appendectomy, anastomosis is gastroileostomy and jejunoileostomy. Now see, how much is the length of this common channel? The length of this common channel is 50 centimeter. Now the problem. Imagine patient is going to eat something and the food stuff is going to enter into ileum. Clear? Now this food stuff is not mixing with bile or pancreatic juice in most of the small bowel. It is going to mix with bile and pancreatic juice only in the distal 50 centimeter. See how this is the bile and pancreatic juice coming here, and then it is going to mix with food. So hardly 50 centimeter, last 50 centimeter is available for digestion and absorption. So what happens here? Most of the food which patient has taken is not digested properly and not absorbed. So what will happen? This undigested food or unabsorbed nutrients are going into colon and finally it is going out. So what is the problem with this procedure? That patient is going to pass malodorous stool. How many times? 2 to 4 times. Clear? Why? Because fat is also not absorbed. So these patients are having steatorrhea. So this patient is having passage of 2 to 4 malodorous stool. But the advantage that this is having maximum weight loss. Clear? So now see how it looks like. This is the liver. Gallbladder has been removed. This is the pancreas. Okay. So what are the procedures which are done? What you did? First you performed distal gastrectomy. Clear? You performed cholecystectomy. We performed appendectomy. Okay. And this anastomosis is gastroileostomy. Gastroileostomy. And this anastomosis, it's known as jejunoileostomy. Clear? So these are the steps. Now the problem. Here you can see this is gastroileostomy. It means whatever the acid is being produced from stomach, this acid is going to enter into the ileum. And there is problem of what? Ulceration at the stoma. So the main problem of this is what? Stomal ulceration. Clear? So this is one of the main problem. What? Stomal ulceration. And second, the common channel is only of 50 centimeter. That's why the side effect is patient is going to pass 2 to 4 malodorous stool. Clear? And second, there is increased risk of deficiency of micronutrients. Vitamin deficiency is also more common here. So this is biliopancreatic diversion. Now what we do in duodenal switch, you can see this is gastroileostomy. So we are putting a switch of duodenum in between the stomach and ileum so that there is no increased risk of stomal ulcer. And second change, we are going to increase the length of this common channel. So we are going to increase it to 100 centimeter. So see how we are going to perform the duodenal switch. duodenal switch. So there is switch of duodenum between stomach and ileum. How it's done? Very easy to understand. This is stomach, clear? This is duodenum, clear? This is jejunum, okay, ileum, and this is cecum, and this is appendix. In biliopancreatic diversion, we were performing the distal gastrectomy, and here we are performing sleeve gastrectomy. Clear? So in sleeve gastrectomy, what we are going to do? We are going to divide or excise 70 to 80% of stomach. So can you see? Here the stomach 70 to 80% is removed, so only sleeve of stomach is left. This is sleeve gastrectomy. After that, we are going to retain some part of first part of duodenum. So retain here the duodenum and then divide it. Clear? So you divided it. After retaining switch of duodenum, you divide the duodenum. Now see, this is what? Liver. This is the gallbladder. This is the bile duct. So we perform cholecystectomy, we perform appendectomy, and we are going to divide the ileum. So this is jejunum, this is ileum, and after dividing this, what we are going to do? This ileum is taken to the duodenal switch, and this jejunum is anastomosed to ileum. So what is the final diagram? Can you see? This was the stomach, and what you performed? You removed the 70 to 80 part of stomach. So this is the part of stomach which is left. This is sleeve. This is the duodenum, red colored. With duodenum, I am going to anastomose what? Ileum. So what is the name of this anastomosis? This is duodenoileostomy. Here appendectomy is done. This is cecum. Now see, this is the duodenum and this is the jejunum. Clear? So this is duodenum, and here you can see this is the liver. Cholecystectomy has been done. This is the pancreas. Simple. Clear? So what are the steps? Can you see here? First, you performed sleeve gastrectomy. There is sleeve gastrectomy in which 70 to 80% of stomach is removed. We performed cholecystectomy. We performed appendectomy. Yes, appendectomy. Now see the anastomosis. Here there is a switch of duodenum between stomach and ileum. That's why this is known as duodenal switch. And what is the name of this anastomosis? This is duodenoileostomy. So the name of this anastomosis, this is duodenoileostomy. Advantage: it is going to decrease the risk of stomal ulcer. And what's the name of this anastomosis? This is jejunoileostomy. The common channel length, it is 100 centimeter. That's why here the malabsorption is not that severe. Weight loss is not that much as seen in biliopancreatic diversion. So this is duodenal switch. So see how duodenal switch looks like. We perform sleeve gastrectomy. 70 to 80% of stomach is removed. So first we perform sleeve gastrectomy. Clear? We have to perform what? Cholecystectomy. Why we perform cholecystectomy? Because in these procedures there is increased risk of gallstone. So cholecystectomy. We have to perform appendectomy. Appendectomy. Clear? And here this is the part of duodenum. Clear? So anastomosis is there actually between duodenum and ileum. So this is duodenoileostomy. Clear? And the name of this anastomosis, this is jejunoileostomy. And the length of common channel, the common channel length is 100 centimeter. Because of this, what is the advantage over biliopancreatic diversion? That there is low risk of malabsorption as compared to biliopancreatic diversion. Low risk of malabsorption, and we have put a switch of duodenum. Because of that, there is decreased risk of stomal ulcers. Decreased risk of stomal ulcers. Clear? So these are the types of bariatric surgical procedures. Now see the one-liner questions which are asked in relation to perioperative mortality in bariatric surgery. So see, perioperative mortality in relation to bariatric surgery. Clear? First, what is the most common cause of death within 30 days of bariatric surgery? So two questions. Most common cause of death. You have to read the language. Within 30 days of bariatric surgery. And second, in immediate post-operative period. Immediate post-operative period. Okay. So what's the problem with the patient? The patient is having obesity, and obesity is a risk factor for DVT. And what happens after massive surgery? Patient is immobilized. So what is the problem? There is increased risk of DVT, and because of this increased risk, there is increased risk of pulmonary embolism. So overall, the most common cause of death within 30 days of surgery, it's pulmonary embolism, followed by cardiac complications, followed by anastomotic leak. Pulmonary embolism, followed by cardiac complications, followed by anastomotic leak. Okay. Now imagine there is death in immediate post-operative period. So in immediate post-operative period, what is the cause of death? It is peritonitis. Why there is peritonitis? Because there is anastomotic leak. So what is the anastomosis from which leak is going to occur? First question. Most common cause of death in immediate post-operative period. It's the anastomotic leak leading to peritonitis. Clear? So question, in bariatric surgery, which anastomosis is having maximum risk of leak? So most commonly performed procedure is RYGB, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and in Roux-en-Y gastric bypass we were making what? Gastrojejunostomy. So what is the most common site of leak? It is the gastrojejunostomy. Clear? So maximum leak or maximum risk of leak occurs from gastrojejunostomy. Clear? So this is all about robotics, laparoscopy and bariatric surgery.